time for another obscure Japanese franchise to come to the Famicom. Although Monster Maker Nanatsu no Hihou isn't considered part of the core series of Monster Maker games. Monster Maker really got its start as a board game, or at least that was the first commercial project. The game took its concepts from its creator's tabletop RPG sessions. That first board game was a huge success, and it became an entire line of board games that continue to this day. And of course, it resulted in its own tabletop RPG. Naturally, something that big had to be made into video games. And so Sofol picked up the license and released a Game Boy game. The numbered entries follow the Game Boy series, but there are 10 Monster Maker games released on 5 different platforms. The Famicom game is the second Monster Maker game, and it follows the more common format for the Monster Maker series. They integrated a lot of the features of the board game to the video game. So dungeons, spells, and characters are treated as cards, and the games are packed with the popular characters from the series. The plot of Monster Maker Nanatsu no Hihou is that the god of the humans has decided that it's finally time to take over. They've sent out their minions to steal the other 6 gods' treasures. A wizard gets wind of this plan, and sends out his young apprentice Lufia to find the Child of Light that can stop it. Your first destination when you start the game is a castle town, and here you start running into a few complications. There are 7 varieties of shops that you need to be aware of, probably more than you'd want to think about. There's 2 types of inns, for example. The ones with the yellow sign let you get a full night's sleep to recover all of your health and magic, while the ones with the red sign will serve you a meal that will heal you partially and also let you talk to patrons to get tips. The temple will restore dead characters to life for a hefty fee, but saving is done at the timekeeper's house. The shops with the sword and shield are armor shops, but only for warrior characters. Your witch has to buy equipment from the magic shops. The one with the yellow sign sells actual equipment like robes and staves, while the red one is where you go to choose your spells. And finally there's an item shop, which is the one with the blue sign. And the annoying thing for this video is that until you complete the first quest, most of those shops are locked up tight. There's also a day-night cycle that determines when things are open, and time progresses as you're wandering around the overworld. The only shop that's available to you from the start are the magic spells, and that's because magic works very differently in Monster Maker. While your characters have magic points, they have to spend those magic points in town to buy cards. The cards don't cost money, just the magic points, and every spell has a level requirement as well as a magic cost. Lufia starts at level 3 with 19 magic points, so you can load her down with quite a few spells. I'd actually recommend getting defensive spells, healing, and status effects when you're starting out. All wizards have one attack spell that they can use by default, so it doesn't do you any good to purchase those early on. When you use a card, it's just gone, and so are your magic points. You'll have to rest up to recover the magic points, and then you can go and acquire the cards again. After getting a quest to go and locate a missing princess, you'll get to your first dungeon, and dungeons in Monster Maker are represented by a field of cards that you turn over by moving into them. In this first dungeon, you'll find 4 people who will join Lufia in exchange for part of the reward for this quest. My recommendation is taking the fighters, because they're the ones who can output some damage, and Lufia is extremely frail. In fact, that's the biggest challenge here. It only takes 1 or 2 hits to kill Lufia, and the dungeon is fairly long. Although with a bit of luck, you could clear this first quest in about 15 minutes, it took me my full hour play session to get through it. Naturally, you can go back and save your progress, but if you have to reset the game, the dungeons are completely reset. Turning over the cards may reveal a treasure for you to collect or an encounter, and you can randomly encounter enemies as you're wandering around. Combat is pretty much standard RPG combat. You start out choosing if you want to fight the monster, do it automatically, or run away, and then you select actions for every character: fight, use a card, use an item, and so on. Defeating a monster rewards you with gold, but not experience. You go up levels when you reach certain story milestones, not by fighting monsters, so you'll always be the correct level for what you're dealing with. But in a way that made it harder, because as I mentioned, Lufia can't survive combat, and she just kept getting one-shotted by enemies as I was exploring the dungeon, forcing me to reset, or spend an absolute ton of cash to revive her. Lufia has to be alive when you reach the end of the dungeon to trigger the event where you talk to the princess and finally meet the main character, the Child of Light. And the Child of Light is a very special character in the game, because they're the one who has the ability to summon monsters. You have to buy monster summons from a monster summoner, though you start with the ability to summon a cave bear. Monsters have to be summoned in combat, and they fill up a party slot. So you'll wind up with a mix of characters that you recruit and monsters that you summon. Monster Maker Nanatsu no Hihou is known for being an incredibly difficult game. With no way to grind up levels, you can't just work at it to clear a difficult section. You have to get lucky to get through the game. And there are a couple game-breaking bugs where if you confront a boss of an area before you do something, then you're locked out from an item you need to complete the game. Not a good thing when there's only 2 save slots. Despite that, the game is really well regarded in Japan. People seem to be pretty enthusiastic about the entire series. This is a very different take on RPGs from what we've seen, and I think I want to go back to it and give it some more time. I'm kind of intrigued by the challenge of it, and I think I want to try out the other Monster Maker games as well. I'll have to keep an eye out for them.